Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the July 25th meeting of the Audit Committee. Roll call, please.
Audit Committee member Ed Khachadurian.
Here.
Alex Parahon.
Here.
Tom O'Shaughnessy.
Present.
Richard Correll is absent. Chair Zare Amirian.
Here. Next item, please.
It's the business agenda. The agenda for the Audit Committee meeting of July 25th, 2016 was posted on Thursday, July 21st, 2016 on the bulletin board outside of City Hall.
Okay, oral communications. I don't have any cards in front of me. Let's move on to the next item, please.
Number 4 is the approval of minutes. Minutes of the Audit Committee meeting held on Monday, April 25th, 2016.
Move adoption as presented.
I second.
Roll call, please.
Audit member Ed Khachadurian. Alex Parahon.
One moment. So the last minutes, Mr. Khachadurian was absent.
I have to abstain, yes.
Let's try that again, please.
Okay. Audit Committee member Ed Khachadurian.
Yeah, I abstain.
Alex Parahon.
Approve.
Tom O'Shaughnessy.
Affirmative.
Richard Correll is absent. And Chair Zare Amirian.
Yes. Next item, please.
Number 5, action items. Election of Audit Committee Chair.
Okay. So, Ms. Chalaspai and I will defer to you to see what the processes will go through. I mean, generally speaking, we'll nominate, entertain nominations, open up the nomination process, close the nomination process, and then there will be a vote. And then at that point, we'll talk about the secretary. So,
One question. Could the staff remind us of the responsibilities of the chair and the secretary of the commission?
Certainly, Mr. Chair, members of the committee, I'm happy to provide that information. Generally, the chairperson of the committee, this committee's chairperson's duties are no different than the other commissions within the city. And specifically, the primary responsibility of the chair is the ministerial oversight and the running of this meeting. So in addition to that, in advance of the meeting, the chair is asked to review the agenda and I think has the authority to call a special meeting without a second committee member providing agreement to that. I don't think that's ever been practiced in the past as it relates to this committee. Our meeting dates are pretty well established in advance, and generally if we need to change a meeting date, then it's generally done with the concurrence of the rest of the body. So primarily the responsibility is to preside over this meeting.
Thank you.
And the process is as the chair described. What we would do now is entertain nominations for the chairperson. They don't need a second, but we will then, if there's more than one nomination, we could do one of two things. We could either do one vote where each person calls the name of the person they'd like to see serve as chair, or alternatively, we could break that up and have a vote on the first candidate, then the second.
following the debate.
Correct.
Right. Okay. Let's start this process. Any nominations?
Any volunteers?
I would nominate the current chair to continue for another year.
Second that.
Unless there are any other nominations, then we would take a vote on that nomination.
Are there any other nominations? Okay.
Would you like a vote at this time?
Yes, please. I want to give everybody an opportunity.
Audit Committee Member Ed Khachaturian,
Yes.
Alex Parajon,
Yes.
Tom O'Shaughnessy,
Affirmative.
Richard Correll's absent, and Chair Zaria Mirian.
Yes. Wonderful. As I do once a year. There we go.
Congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, gentlemen, for your continued support of this very important and, no, I'm kidding. Thank you. I appreciate it. Let's move on to nominating and the electing a secretary. So in the past, what we have done is, and we can surely change this, but what we've done is nominated a person who's a member of staff outside of the actual committee to handle the secretary duties, and that person has been Ms. Cha Espanian, who's done a fantastic job, if I may say so. So I would like to nominate Ms. Cha Espanian for the committee secretary.
I would concur. It's a ominous task. When I open this up before the commission meeting, I'm impressed with the detail, and I don't think it's something we need to change. It seems to be working just fine.
Okay, well, if there are any other nominations or volunteers for secretary, in that case, I'd like to, well, first, Ms. Chalaspan, would you, are you willing to accept this?
She really doesn't have a choice.
This very important honor?
Yes, I'll be honored to serve as the secretary to the Audit Committee.
Wonderful. That's really the only requirement is that you accept. Vote, please. Roll call.
Audit Committee Member Ed Khachaturian,
Yes.
Alex Parajon,
Yes.
Tom O'Shaughnessy,
Happily affirmative.
Richard Correll's absent, and Chair Zaria Amirian.
Yes. Wonderful. What's the next item on this agenda?
It's 5C, the annual report to City Council.
So every year, the committee sends a report to the council, and this year it should be in your packets. We're doing the same, and so I'd like any comments or questions regarding this proposed annual statement.
I only have one question. Besides this actual two-sided 8.5 by 11 letter to the City Council, do they get an attachment or a reference back to the fact of all the reports we allude to?
Every time a report is issued, it's also line CC to the City Council as well.
Okay. That's my only question.
Any other questions?
No.
Actually, I guess I have a question. If, in case the committee would like to make a recommendation that is not part of the annual process, I guess, will that, the committee usually makes the recommendation via this annual letter, or it can make recommendations? So these are all basically the tasks that we have completed. We have reviewed this, we have received this document, we have affirmed, for example, the continued use of the independent auditors. But if, in case, the committee would like to make a recommendation regarding a specific task, will that happen through this letter, or it's going to be something separate?
It would probably, if I may, it would probably first come up during the context of this meeting. If there's a recommendation on the part of the committee to amend the annual plan by adding an additional area to audit, that would generally come up in the context of this meeting. And if for whatever reason the staff is not in agreement with the committee and the committee feels strongly about advancing that to the City Council, then it would be outside of this annual meeting report or annual report.
So it would start out as an item of new business, as a matter of just how it would function?
Yes, it would come up during the meeting as probably during audit committee comments, or if it falls naturally within another audit that's being discussed, it would come up in that context, and then staff would review it and report back, and then at that point it would be agendized, so you'd have an opportunity to discuss it thoroughly.
Thank you.
Was there something specifically that you had in mind, or were you just asking a general?
No, really, I was asking a general question, and the reason being was that, I thought, for example, 2 meetings ago, if we had an issue that we thought that we need to bring this up to the attention of the City Council, then do we have to wait until we issue this letter, or we can just maybe start a communication right after we realize that we need to have a communication with the City Council? Certainly,
as an individual audit committee member, you may always reach out to any council member to have a conversation with them. But specifically, if you're looking to audit an area, then it should come up in this environment first.
Thank you.
Any further questions or comments regarding the annual report of the audit committee? Okay, I believe it's an action item, so we have to approve it. So roll call, please. Or no, actually, we need a motion.
So moved.
Second.
So the motion being specifically that this annual report will be submitted to the City Council, if I'm understanding correctly. Roll call, please.
Audit Committee Member Ed Khachadurian.
Yes.
Alex Parajon.
Yes.
Tom O'Shaughnessy.
Affirmative.
Richard Krell's absent, and Chair Zare Amirian.
Yes. Next item, please.
Number 6A, Internal Audit Activity Report as of June 30th, 2016. Eileen Donahue, Internal Audit Manager.
Good morning, Chair and committee members. Eileen Donahue, Internal Audit Manager. During the quarter ended June 30, 2016, we completed 3 projects, and at this time I'd like to invite our Internal Auditor, Samil, to come up and give the briefing on the first audit.
Morning.
Morning.
Good morning.
Good morning, Mr. Chair, Mr. Audit Committee members. My name is Samil Salim, and I'm an internal auditor within the Internal Audit Division. I'm going to be presenting the findings of my natural gas contract management audit. The objective of the audit was to determine if natural gas contracts were managed in accordance with policies and procedures. The scope was July 2015 to December 2015. And the reason why we picked July is because there was a new system that went online called Allegro. And so I thought it would be more pertinent to pick everything going forward from that point on. The areas reviewed were policies and procedures to get an understanding of the process as a whole, active natural gas contracts within Allegro, the system of record to make sure the contracts were valid. The PO amounts we spent within the PO amounts, and that they were all signed and on file. We inspected natural gas contracts. They were properly reviewed, approved, and substantiated prior to being paid. And we looked at the system of record, Allegro, to make sure that there were adequate segregation of duties within the system itself. Overall, the controls were adequate, but we did have 5 recommendations for improvement. There were no priority 1 findings. There were 1 priority 2, and the remaining were priority 3 findings. So with that, we'll get into the findings themselves. The first one was priority 2 recommendation was regarding the system itself, Allegro. There are 6 user classifications within the system, and we found that in 4 of the 9 users had super user access, which could pretty much perform every function within the system. In a small shop, it's not unusual. However, there should be some compensating controls when there's a lack of segregation of duties, and there was not in this case. The remaining observations were all priority 3 observations. So the next one is policies and procedures. They do have, the good thing, they do have them. It's just that they need to be formally signed off by management. The remaining 3 have all been implemented already. The review process regarding one of the natural gas contracts does not include validating the market price per MMBTU prior to being paid. The second one is, these are large transactions, as you probably know, so we recommend that City Council have some informational visibility to these on an annual basis. And finally, the last one is, there's multiple reviews prior to an invoice being paid, given the large dollar amounts of these invoices. And so we recommend that all the subsequent reviewers check the system of record prior to reviewing it. That would make the review more meaningful and less mathematical. And if you have you, with that was pretty much my audit. I'm here to answer any questions. We have a GWP representative as well. If you have.
So a couple quick questions from me. How do you determine whether a risk is a priority 2 or a priority 1?
There's
a subjective
yes.
Determination of that. And I know that priority 2 risks, as far as what we have asked and require, have a different standard than priority 1 risks in terms of how they're reported. So how is that decision made, whether something is priority 2 or priority 1?
I believe it's very subjective. It's thinking about the impact to the city, to the operations. And so we try to look at what we're auditing and what is the potential risk to the operation that they're auditing. Is it really severe? Is there a high financial risk? Is there very no controls? So there's not like a set box. We have to evaluate it when we're doing the work.
You know, specifically, you mentioned that there were high dollar amounts in terms of the invoices. What's a high dollar amount?
$500,000 for one invoice per month.
So, trying to understand, if somebody has super user access, they're able to create invoices and approve them within the system?
No.
Yeah. So, I mean, the system itself has six roles with them, right? Mm-hmm. But they can't necessarily approve an invoice because that takes someone else to enter it, and there's multiple people that review it along the way. But they do have that role.
But the payment of the invoice is done through Department of Finance,
yeah,
and there's
yeah.
other controls over when we're issuing disbursements out of the city.
So like everyone, so like the whole process up to a payment time, that's all within Allegro. But after that, there's multiple reviews within finance itself that are checking the invoice to make sure it's substantiated, that there's support behind the invoices, and that all the necessary sign-offs have been obtained. So I don't really think that per se is a risk. I mean, it's not a big risk. That's why it was a Category 2 versus a Category 1 in our professional judgment.
So the reasoning being, just so that I understand clearly, the reasoning being that there are systems outside of this specific department that will check that. That's the reason why this was deemed a priority 2 and not a priority 1.
Yes.
Okay.
On priority 2, where you say number of Allegro users with system admin rights is not adequately limited or monitored, is there a category that allows read-only that you may want to drop someone's access from composing or edit entries into just reading it? And does this include a redundancy factor? Because you may want 2 people to have the same authority because someone could be out of the office or on vacation. I'm just trying to figure out how you have not adequately limited and what is being done about it.
So just to clarify, is your question, what are some remediation activities they can do to limit some of these users? Okay. They can. I was just saying if they want to chime in, but they could do multiple things. You could limit users, but they have a very small shop. So part of the reasons why they allowed some, and correct me if I'm wrong, part of the reasons why they allowed some of these people to have multiple roles is given how small they are. When someone's out, you want to be able to facilitate the transaction and make sure everything moves along. And I also just. I did take just randomly, I took an IT security class, and I asked the executive who was giving the class, I gave him the situation without naming names or organizations, and he mentioned this is very common in small shops, but what they do have, when they do have multiple roles is that, like I said, they have compensating controls, like they have someone checking exception reports. What are these people doing? What are the activities that these people are doing, independent of the people who have the roles themselves, so that if, in fact, something were to occur like that, it would be caught fast. So that's one of the ways they could remediate this is by having these monitoring controls.
I guess then my question, and to follow up very quickly, would be if the number of people with redundancy are based on efficiency, then why is it a priority 2? It's like you're saying this is a problem, but it's necessary. Then why is it a problem?
Well, because they don't have these extra monitoring things that would make it okay. And that's why it's a priority. Had they had these external monitoring systems in place, I wouldn't even have it as observation, probably.
Well, and I imagine that each department, we shouldn't even get to the point where there's an outside department going, what is this, flagging it. It should happen within the department.
Right.
And so, I do think it's an issue, and I think that's why you noted it. So now that security role that you mentioned within the report, how is that security role being defined then? Because I imagine it's somebody that shares multiple responsibilities.
Right. So 2 of the 4 super users are security personnel with the security role, but they are not performing any security responsibilities as far as we normally think of them. They're more in the IT group just making sure that the system remains operational. They're not really they're not checking active users or should I remove them when someone leaves, things of that nature.
So how is that going to change?
So that's one of the things they're going to be working on addressing prior to this being closed out.
I can also give you some background. Allegro just went live in July, and so you see the users are the holdover users from when they were implementing the system, and so this was a really good opportunity for us to go and evaluate who still had access and what were their roles and to tighten up those roles at this point since implementation.
So one of the results of this audit when it's closed is the possible redefinition of particular users.
Potentially.
Thank you.
And a reduction of users themselves.
Thank you.
Just a quick question. So every time an invoice is received, you're recommending that somebody needs to maybe check the market prices for that. Is that how it works, or do we have like a contracted price? Or
yeah. So there are 3 main suppliers of natural gas to the city. This is pertaining to one of the 3.
Oh.
And so when they provide an invoice, it's a prepaid contract. So when they provide the invoice, it's based on market price at the time, less applicable discount, times the volume. So to get the market price requires a fairly expensive subscription to these people who provide services like that. So they just take the price given times the volume, which they know, and then they approve it at that point. The recommendation was to independently validate it for that one invoice that we're talking about. So I think they're going to get an actual printout from some type of authoritative market publishing source of some type, and that would and provide that in the package, and so that would support it.
Has there been a review of past transactions and invoices to see if the city's overpaid or underpaid?
That was a check I did for this 6-month period for all invoices for natural gas. Prior, I'm not sure.
So,
are you saying an audit prior to this audit?
well, I'm curious. In the past 6 months, has the city overpaid or underpaid?
I haven't. For the 6 months that I looked at, 100% of all natural gas transactions, they were all pretty much right on the dot. So
Okay.
I did not find that. But, but I was only looking at 6 months.
Has there been any impact with the occurrences in the northeast part of the valley about natural gas and the problems? Has that affected the city of Glendale at all?
Ramon would have to speak to that.
Yeah, that was out of my scope. But
Wow.
Ramon.
I think you're talking about the
This is a
Lisa
mood-
Canyon.
Yes.
mood lighting.
Yeah, that's right. We're keeping
Good
the
morning,
lights low.
Commissioners. Ramon Abueg, Chief Assistant General Manager for GWP. There's minimal impact arising from the Aliso Canyon. So Aliso Canyon really is just some sort of a relief valve. I'm calling it relief valve for gas. So we supply our own gas. The only factor that the Aliso Canyon plays in is if all the users of gas in the area, they're either under schedule or over schedule, Aliso Canyon will not be able to provide relief. So what's happened with our scheduling for everyone is they now gave us a tight tolerance, plus or minus 5%. As long as we maintain those tolerance, Aliso Canyon has not played a big role. The past 2 heat waves that we've done pretty well. The Aliso Canyon had not played a role in terms of reduction in resources available to us.
Thank you.
Okay.
Mr. Slim, I have another question. Also, this one is in regards to the quantity, invoice quantity. Is there any internal, checks or controls in place to also validate the quantity? And if so, could you just maybe tell us a little bit about that?
for the quantity
Quantity of consumption, right.
of gas. So there's a lot of vendors involved, right, doing different things. So one of the vendors is we have a natural gas contract manager who actually reconciles, monitors our purchases, ins and outs, and they're independent from some of these different other purchases. So we have multiple different vendors that we could bounce around to make sure that all the numbers are tied together. Our gas plants have meters on them to show how much gas is being used at the plant. So it's not too difficult to reconcile the ins and outs on a.
But this is something that is currently being implemented, or this is part of your recommendation?
No, they're doing that now.
So just going back to my question, so based on your audit of the past 6 months, do you think that there is, in your opinion, do you think there's any concern that the city overpaid for gas contracts in the past?
I can't, because this is like I'm going to give you like auditor speak, right? I mean, so I can't comment on that because I haven't looked at it, but I have not seen anything in the 6 months I looked at that would lead me to that conclusion.
That's all I wanted. All I wanted. Any other questions? Okay, thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you.
Thank you.
The second audit on our listing is the Public Benefit Programs Audit, and I'm going to invite Natalie up to talk about it.
Good morning, Chair Marion and fellow Audit Committee members. My name is Natalie Minami, and I'm a Senior Internal Auditor within the Internal Audit Division, and I'm here to present to you the Glendale Water and Power Public Benefit Programs Audit. The Public Benefits Program came about as a result of a state mandate surcharge on electric bills to be used in one of the following 4 program categories. These categories included low income, energy efficiency and conservation, renewable energy, and research development and demonstration programs. Per the Glendale Municipal Code, a 3.6% public benefit charge is assessed and collected on electric charges and maintained in a separate city fund for public benefit programs. For fiscal year 2015-16, public benefit revenues approximated $7 million and funded 17 Glendale Water and Power public benefit programs. 9 of these programs were administered in-house, 6 were administered through SCAPA contracts, and 2 were administered through city-executed contracts. The objective of our audit was to determine if program expenditures met the Glendale Municipal Code requirements and that effective controls had been established to ensure that the funds were appropriately and accurately distributed. The scope of my audit included the 9 public benefit programs administered in-house by Glendale Water and Power and the related rebates and incentives awarded for July 1, 2015 through March 16, 2016. During the course of the audit, information was gathered on the public benefit programs administered by Glendale Water and Power. We learned that policies and procedures are individually documented and reviewed on a biannual basis. And based on a walkthrough of each program, we obtained an understanding of the application receipt, application review, and payment processes. We conducted test procedures on a sample of records to examine the application documentation for eligibility of the recipients and accuracy of the benefits allowed. And lastly, we reviewed selective North Star billing module user accesses. Overall, from the information gathered and the test work performed, we found that the public benefit program expenditures met the required purpose of the Glendale Municipal Code, and that controls in place are generally effective for ensuring that the funds are distributed accurately and appropriately. As a result of the audit, there were 10 opportunities for improvement identified. There were no priority 1s, there were 5 priority 2s, and 5 priority 3s. The priority 2 observations included an inadequate segregation of duties and independent review in the application review process for the low-income programs and smart home rebates. So, for example, an employee performs the incompatible duties of receiving and recording the application, approving the payment, and then entering the credit into the billing system. Although we recognize that with limited staffing, it may not always be possible to properly segregate the duties, it's recommended that a mitigating control be established, such as an independent review process. Management has agreed to implement a procedure to periodically review a sample of the program applications and payments. A second observation was that sensitive application information, such as Social Security numbers and medical information, was not properly safeguarded in locked cabinets. Management was very proactive in addressing this issue and now maintains all applications in locked cabinets and also has limited access to the office to key card access only. The third observation had to do with the Guardian program. This is a great program which provides discounted rates for household residents that require electrically powered medical equipment and is categorized as a low-income program. However, based on our review, we noted that a low-income requirement was not being enforced. So as a result, there's a risk that Guardian electricity rates were not eligible to be paid with public benefit revenues. So it was recommended and management agreed to enforce the low-income requirement and to identify additional funding for those participants that do not meet the low-income requirement. Lastly, for the priority 2s, control enhancements were identified for processing and support of the solar solution and energy efficiency programs, such as the calculation of the window rebates, documentation of the Energy Star eligibility for the appliance and window rebates, and the verification of components used to the invoices attached for the solar solutions rebates. The remaining observations were priority 3s and were related to the reconciliation of internal schedules to the appropriate system of record, utility billing user access controls, and program applications supporting documentation and processing. This concludes my presentation. I, as well as representatives from Glendale Water and Power, are now available to answer any questions you might have.
Gentlemen?
I have a question real quick. So on the Guardian program, how much of an impact was it for not actually seeing, from the folks that were actually getting the Guardian program that were higher income folks, what was the impact of that for the city?
Unfortunately, because we didn't have a low income requirement, we didn't gather income information, so we're not able to say what the total impact was. Let me see if, but the annual expenditure for the Guardian program total, including the low income and those that may not have been eligible, was $196,000.
So who got those?
Who got the
$196,000 if it potentially wasn't low income? How did they make the decision to give that $196,000?
I believe because it was a public benefit to offer those residents that have their requirement was that they have medical equipment that uses electricity. So basically, any household member that could substantiate what the doctors know. Basically, there was a form that's signed by the doctor with the prescribed equipment and the kilowatts. I think it was the amount of energy that's used, and based on that, they determined the tier of the electricity rate to be applied.
If I got this correctly, you mentioned there are 17 public benefit programs, and all of these are listed on the website somewhere so that people can easily see that. And the total cost for all of that is $7 million.
That was the total. That was the estimated revenue or public benefit surcharges that were collected. The budget, I believe, for 15-16 was $6.4 million.
And sort of a follow-up question, let's say if a household qualifies as a low income, do you also contact them next year, or they have to resubmit an application? How does that work?
The staff within the public benefits group, they do a recertification. It's not necessarily done on an annual basis due to the number of applications, but there is a recertification process in place.
Also, on page 1, when you show the proposed budgets, though I guess this is historical, where Glendale Care, Guardian, and Helping Hand stay the same. What was the reason that senior care dropped? Was that positive efficiencies, or did we have a smaller pool of applicants? Or
I will ask the representatives from Glendale Water and Power to come up and answer that question for you.
Thank you.
I'm Craig Keaton, Business Transformation and Marketing Administrator for Glendale Water and Power. We have 2 low-income programs. We have the senior care, which is closed to new applicants. We started that program 15 years ago, and originally you had to be 62 or older. About 6 years ago, we started a straight low-income program. So people now apply for the Glendale Care, and no new people apply for senior care. That's why it gets lower every year.
So it's a declining population.
Yes, or they just move and reapply to Glendale Care.
What was your title again?
Business Transformation and Marketing Administrator. Every year they add a word to it. More duties, but
I was curious.
The pay stays the same. So.
I'm curious. The administration for 15-16 is listed as $500,000. Can you explain to me? Is that the staff is just a completely different staff that handles just this public benefits portion of the GWP? So they don't have any other responsibilities?
Parts of other salary will get charged there, like part of my salary gets charged there. But there is dedicated staff.
Questions, gentlemen?
I have a question about the applicant information lacks adequate security. How inadequate was the security? I mean, was security numbers, applications were just laying somewhere, or were they actually in a file cabinet but it just wasn't locked? Is that what it was?
Yes.
Okay.
Sorry. The applications were maintained within their office and in file cabinets. They just weren't locked. Now they've all been locked in.
Okay.
Can I ask a question? Are we just saying a standard locking file cabinet, or I'm an Air Force veteran and I had a top secret clearance, and when I had something locked, it was in a file cabinet with a bar with a second lock in a vault. So it was 3 levels of security. Are we just saying a locked filing cabinet, or are we saying multiple locks or limited access to how to unlock it?
It is locked in a regular locking file cabinet with access limited to, I believe, a couple of staff members. But also, like I mentioned, before the offices were accessible, the door was unlocked. And at this time, they've installed key card access, so it is locked from public access.
So in a sense, it is now a vault because of limited access. Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
The third project that we completed for the quarter was the remote access control assessment. This is a project that was completed by our auditor, Jessie. She does a lot of our information system audits. This was requested by the Director of Information Services Department, and it was an assessment of the remote access controls over our city's network. It involved very sensitive data, and no report was issued publicly. The results of the assessment was communicated to the director, and he is making corrective actions from what we've identified.
So in a sense, this was a need to know, and very few people need to know.
Something like that.
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay, yeah, I mean, I understand that need to know. At what point do we need to know?
We are following up on a regular basis. It's not that we gave him the information and then said goodbye. We are going to be following up on a quarterly basis to make sure that he's doing what he needs to do, and he's very proactive. It's one of his strategic goals for the year to work with the remote access controls, and so this was something he asked us to look at so he could have a really good picture of what's going on. So trying to give you comfort that we are continuing working with him, and it is something very important to the director.
So go ahead.
Is this something where if we wanted to look at it, we have the ability to make an appointment, or it is not accessible to look at?
Mr. Chair, members of the committee, if you recall, there are a number of instances where, for security reasons or attorney-client privilege reasons, we will report on the fact that an audit was completed, but will not share with you certain aspects of the audit or the entire audit, depending on the nature of the audit itself. So in response to your question, I'm not personally familiar with this audit. It may be that this is the extent of the information that you receive. However, if for whatever reason, and again, I'm not familiar with the audit to speak to this specific audit, but if the nature of it were to change and it was no longer a security concern, at that point, that type of an audit may come back to the committee.
So generally speaking, I want to follow up on that. So attorney-client privilege, I understand, and that's happened in the past where due to attorney-client privilege, we were not presented with information. This seems to be that the security risk of presenting such information to the public outweighs, whatever consideration there is for the transparency that this committee is designed to promote. However, me as a committee chair or any committee member asking to see something that's attorney-client privilege is unreasonable, I would say. But does the security risk preclude presenting the committee with the information outside of a public meeting?
We would have no opportunity to present it to the committee outside of a public meeting. It would have to be done in the context of this meeting, and then if we were to present it to you individually, then you would be no different than any other member of the public, and for that reason we couldn't share the information with you privately.
Is there any ability for the commission to meet as a committee of the whole, or do we have any kind of a cut-in where other people do for personnel matters, where something can be discussed off the record, off camera, or that's not something we're set up to do?
Well, there are certain exceptions to the Brown Act that permit legislative bodies such as this to meet in a closed session. We haven't had any item come up in that context to permit for that meeting to take place.
Thank you.
Hypothetically speaking, I know you're an attorney and you love these questions. Hypothetically speaking, would something like this permit a closed meeting under the rules of the Brown Act?
No, there's no exception for this particular rule.
Great. So, yeah, keep us posted, very generally speaking, on how that's going. Let's move on.
Moving on, quarter ending, we had 5 projects in progress. I have them listed. We have the Fleet Faster System audit, the Magnolia Power Plant project audit that we're doing in cooperation with the City of Anaheim, the Records Management audit, the Safety Grant Operational audit, and also the Storage Tanks audit. So those are all continuing. We're either in the planning or the fieldwork stage of all 5 of these. Moving on, we also, every quarter, we contact the director where we've issued audit reports where there's outstanding audit issues. And when we did that at June 30th, we started the quarter with 30 outstanding audit issues. Based on the 2 reports that were issued, we had additional 15. And we found when we did our follow-up, 15 had been implemented, so we're back to 30 outstanding audit issues at the end of the quarter. And to highlight some of the more significant ones, we generally talk about anything that's priority 1 or that move into the non-implemented stage. Again, we have priority 1. This is one I briefed on last quarter. This is at the Department of Finance for the disbursement and duplicate payments audit. This has to do with changing the policies, and Department of Finance, it's contingent on approvals from other departments, so it has not been implemented yet. However, the one change I believe that happened for this quarter was that the purchasing section drafted a policy revision, which has gone forward for approval through the city manager's office. So there are strides being taken to get this cleared.
When we saw this over the weekend, when you sent us our commission homework, there were a number of items in 3 different places that were highlighted in red, which we don't have on a black and white copy. My question was, were the items that were highlighted in red because they were priority 1, or was highlighted in red meant that they were in planned fiscal year 17 versus planned fiscal year 18?
What I think you're referring to is it's going to be part of 6B. It's our internal audit work plan. And it's when on Exhibit 4, we have the full audit universe, and anything that was in red were ones that were on the proposed work plan for fiscal year 16-17. So it's unrelated to the outstanding audit observation, and we'll get to that.
Thank you.
Moving forward, during the quarter, there was one outstanding audit issue that met the criteria that it hadn't been implemented within 2 years, and that was part of the mobile device operational audit. And generally, if something moves to that category, we ask the department director to be here to discuss it with you, if you would like. And unfortunately, that was issued to the Information Services Department, and that director already had obligations, personal obligations, so he was not able to attend today. But he's fully aware and plans to attend at the next meeting if it's not implemented. I can try to give you a little bit of background. It is another policy that's outstanding. It seems that it takes a while for our city to get our policies implemented, but this particular one is he has a pilot project going right now with mobile devices, and until that pilot project is completed and he has the results of that, he doesn't want to write a policy until he really knows how to write where it should go, where that policy should go. So that's what's holding that observation up from being completed.
So this would be, we'll revisit this in October?
Yes. And then we end up our project update. We just list if any of the auditors have been on a team assignment, and this is more where we're at an advisory role in standard meetings that occur, and that occurred 3 times during this quarter. If you have any questions overall, I'd be happy to answer them.
This has already started because it had a completion date of December, correct?
What is that?
Are we on item D?
No.
Or am I jumping?
No.
No, you jump.
Okay, let's move on to the next item.
It's item 6B, Internal Audit Fiscal Year 2015-16 Work Plan Review and 2016-17 Proposed Audit Work Plan. Eileen Donahue, Internal Audit Manager.
What you have in front of you is a full document. There's a Word document and then a number of exhibits. And please ask questions as I go through this because I'm going to be bouncing around. So just ask those questions. Starting out with what this is, basically it's our work plan. It identifies how we used our resources in the prior fiscal year and how we plan to use our resources next year and even potentially on the horizon after that. Going straight to Exhibit 1 is our reconciliation of the hours that we spent on our project in fiscal year 15-16. It shows a listing of 25 projects where we spent 5,720 hours. 5 of those projects that we work on are regular, we call them internal audit regular projects. They're ongoing team assignments, quarterly follow-up, the audit committee, and just general department support, quality control. We also list out here, we list out the carryover projects that came from the prior fiscal year, the 14-15 into 15-16. So we had 4 projects that carried over. We have listed here our 2 unplanned projects because last year we didn't expect to do the Magnolia Power Plant audit, or we didn't expect to do the comparative data analysis. So those were added on. So that leaves us with 14 projects that were on our plan, and it just tells you the hours that we spent and also addresses if we did not get to it. So that is our reconciliation of what we did last year. If you have any questions, let me know.
So, what was the effect of that 1,000-hour comparative data analysis on audits that had been planned and didn't get completed?
What happens is we didn't end up picking them up, but anything that didn't get completed last year, we reevaluate for this proposed audit work plan, which I can get into when we start talking about how we do that. But just because we identified we were going to do an audit last year doesn't necessarily mean it's a good or bad thing that we didn't pick it up. This is a very flexible document, and we always have to remember that changes occur throughout the year that reprioritize what we're going to do. So if something wasn't picked up from 15-16, we do reevaluate it for the next proposed audit work plan.
So in a sense, the list of these things is the total universe of potential audits, not necessarily needed audits.
Right.
And that's what you're evaluating ongoingly day to day.
And it's always changing. It's based on different priorities that occur.
So it looks like that out of the 14, I guess we can call them projects, you have 6 of them are either rescheduled or have a reprioritization of risk. Could you just maybe tell us a little bit about that? What, like you start working on it and then you decide that it's...
I'll start talking about that because I can get into when we did our proposed audit work plan for the current year.
Oh.
And so that's when meaning about reprioritization of risk. Every year we meet. We're not an audit shop where we wait for somebody to call us and say, can you go do an audit on this project. We try to look at all city departments. We try to have communications. We do have communications with all the executive members to make sure our audit resources are being used to the best for the city overall. So every year we have a series of questions that we have an open dialogue with the directors. Those questions are listed at Exhibit 3, where we go in and we say, what's happened in your department? What do you expect to happen in the future? What are your significant regulatory requirements? These aren't just the questions we ask. It kind of opens up that communication, and then it goes on from there, and we learn more about what's really going on in their operations and where are the risks, where are the directors' concerns, where are their staff concerns. So we do that. Then we also have a full universe of potential audit subjects that is always changing, and that's at Exhibit 4. Right now, it shows that we evaluated 129 projects, which we don't have the resources to audit 129 projects in 1 year. So based on those communications that we have, we add to this listing, or we may take away. Maybe we find that there was a project on there that is no longer, controls have really been put in place. It's no longer a significant project. We don't have it on there. So after we do those communications, then we also sit down with those directors and we say, okay, let's think about what is the risk of these projects. And we evaluate the impact and the likelihood of risk. And we consider not just like what's the impact of risk overall. We say there's 4 categories: financial, compliance, reputational, and operational. We say, what is the impact when we're looking at this workers' compensation? What is the impact financially associated with workers' compensation? And we give it a rating of high, medium, or low. Then we do that over the categories. But we also think about the likelihood. What is the likelihood, based on the control structure that you have right now, what is the likelihood of a risk associated with financial, compliance, operational, and reputational risk? So we do that, and we form, this is a big process. We form a listing and we say, okay, where should we use our audit resources? And I not only take it by high risk, we also have to think about what is management suggesting, because they really know their operations, and something may not go up to the high risk, but it is a strong concern of management that we get in there and we understand what is going on, how can we identify efficiencies in their program, or just what audit can we do in that area. Also, we can't just focus on one department because our resources need to be used citywide. So we also try to build our plan over 2 years where we're going to be in almost 100% of the departments. So we do that as well. And we also think about if something has already been audited in the more recent years or is audited right now. I have an example that there's one that looks like it's high risk on here: fire prevention, environmental management, operational audit. It was high. It showed high on my listing, but when I followed up with the director, what he made this go high was storage tanks and designated operators. And right now we have a storage tank audit in process, so that we're already covering that. So it's this full process where you're trying to deal with risk, you're trying to deal with the strategic operations of the city. I build this and I try to have an open mind, and then I communicate to Bob and Michelle as well. Like, what do you know about the city that I don't know that we can, what should we really be looking at? And then after we get that listing, we also meet with Yasmin and Scott to get their perspective on what's going on in the city and how to best use our resources. Again, it's a flexible document, so it does change. And so when I talk about reprioritization of risk, getting back to that, we go through this whole process. Those are added back on, and we consider it with the universe as a whole on what to audit. So based on all that, Exhibit 2 shows the proposed work plan for fiscal year 16-17. And also when we do this, we have a horizon of fiscal year 17-18 and what would we audit out there. Again, we're trying to get almost all the departments. The one that's missing is City Treasury, which in the last 5 years we did do a Treasury audit, and that's a much smaller organization, and so that's not listed here. Getting into the plan for fiscal year 16-17, we have 5 big carryover projects that are going into the current year. We have our normal activities that we do. So that left us, we have about 6,200 hours that we can use for our staff resources. So from that, we have an additional 9 audits that we selected to do in the current year. That's out of a universe of 129. So what we're really trying to do is plan our resources to provide the best benefit to the city overall. So if you could look it over, and then if you have any suggestions or...
Is there a number of hours that are kind of in the bank for an unplanned audit that pops Or do you have to, the minute that something may show up in fiscal year 17 that becomes more urgent, then that means something on the fiscal 17 proposed calendar has now become a fiscal 18.
Or it gets reevaluated when we do our work plan.
And you mentioned under the 4 categories, compliance is obviously state laws, federal laws, county supervisor. Reputational would be in the sense of if cities of comparable size elsewhere in the area, an issue has arisen, you then have to make the subjective judgment of whether an audit is necessary to answer an unasked question.
When I think of reputation, it's when I'm looking at a particular audit subject and I'm thinking, you think about the newspaper. If something goes wrong with this audit subject, what would be the reputation to the public for related to that area? Is there a high risk that would be a really big concern, or is there low risk? We used to call it political, and I changed it this year to reputation.
That's what I was, thank you.
Any questions or comments regarding current year or the potential suggested 17-18?
Just an observation, this is a marvelous primer as we go forward, because this is something to keep in the A part of your binder, because this is something to refer back to, so that when you make a subsequent report for changes, we can refer back to this. And thank you very much.
Okay, I believe this is a report, so no action needed on this.
Correct. No.
Okay, let's move on, please. Thank you.
Number 6C is fiscal year 2016-17 budget adoption update. Audrey Esayan, Budget Manager.
Oh, wait, Audrey.
Good morning, Chair Marion and members of the Audit Committee. My name is Audrey Esayan. I'm the Budget Manager with the Finance Department, and today I've prepared a brief presentation on the 16-17 budget process. We have a PowerPoint ready too, so I'll be referring to what's in front of you as well as what's on the screen. As a part of the 16-17 budget process, we held a few study sessions. We annually will conduct a few study sessions for the residents as well as for the City Council. And this year we had a total of 3 budget study sessions. Our first study session was held on May 3rd, and the topics of discussion included the fiscal year 15-16 third quarter budget update, as well as any adjustments and year-end projections we had for 15-16. We also talked about organizational profile. We provided a general fund forecast for the residents and for council, as well as proposed the 16-17 general fund budget. Sorry, I should be doing this as I go along. It's hard to do it sideways, so sorry if I can't manage. Our second study session was held on May 10th, and the topic of discussions included a summary of appropriations, capital improvement programs citywide, as well as any proposed new fees and increases we had for 16-17. May 17th was our third budget study session. Topics of discussion included City Council priorities, salary and benefit history, as well as a general fund forecast, summary of appropriations for the general fund as well as all funds, a citywide fee schedule, and we had some alternative budget scenarios for revenue resource options and some general fund reductions in the event that Measure N for UUT appeal was successful, which we know wasn't, but we were prepared to discuss some reductions and alternative strategies. We had a hearing at 6 p.m. on May 24th, and our budget adoption was on June 14th in the evening at 6 p.m. The next few slides go over our general fund budget. the general fund is the city's primary fund. It's basically where all the expenditures and revenues are, where there's no restrictions. And the next two slides focus on the general fund budget by department. Some of the things that I wanted to discuss in particular to these two slides is there's a lot of variances from department to department, but the large ones are in community development, community services and parks, library, arts and culture, fire, and police. The reason for these variances are two things. One, Economic Development Fund used to be a special revenue fund in the Community Development Department, and you're seeing a $5 million increase here over last year because the fund moved to the general fund this year. So it switched fund types. It came from special revenue fund to a general fund. That's almost $5 million increase to the Community Development Fund as a result. And the second thing is last year in 15-16, we created a building maintenance fund to move out the custodial services and the building maintenance functions in the general fund out to the building maintenance fund to cost allocate back. But we didn't actually cost allocate and establish a rate until this year. So you're seeing that in public works, and you're seeing a $3.7 million decrease, but that's redirected back to the supporting departments such as fire, police, library, who have building and custodial services in there. So that's where the large variances are coming in. Overall, the general fund budget had $194.7 million adopted. It's almost $12 million more than it was last year, or a 6.5% increase over last year. This slide focuses on the general fund forecast. We use a forecast as a planning tool to look at the 5 to 7 year outlook in the future to see how we're planning on spending, what revenues we have coming in. We adopted the 15-16 budget with a $2.8 million surplus, but as of third quarter, we estimated the surplus to be $2.4 million. 16-17, we adopted with a use of fund balance of $1 million, but going in the future years, we're going to be back into the positive according to our plan. Slide 7 is a summary of all appropriations. It's basically a breakdown of the total adopted budget for 16-17 by fund type. General fund, $194.7 million, or as you saw in the previous slides. Special revenue funds, which are basically revenues and expenditures that are restricted in nature from state, federal, or local grants. And we have $100.6 million there. Debt service fund, $3 million. This is for the police building project, so we only have one debt service currently in the city. Capital improvement funds, these are our capital projects, $25.3 million. Enterprise funds, which are basically proprietary funds that provide services to our external customers and charge a rate, $385.9 million. Internal service funds, again, a proprietary fund, but we're providing a service to internal customers, so they're charging a rate for things like workers' comp, ISD services, and other internal operations, $109.8 million. For a total adopted budget of $819.5 million, $21.7 million more than what we had last year, or 2.7%. On slide 7, we have a capital improvement program recap. General fund, Fund 401, is what we consider the general fund of capital expenditures, because the primary source of revenue in Fund 401 is a transfer from the general fund as well as the Shoal Canyon royalty fees. And we have about $6.7 million in appropriation in the 401 fund. Other funds, community services and parks, $16.1 million. That's basically development impact fee money that we have appropriated for projects. $555,000 in the library, arts and culture. That's from the library mitigation fund expenditures. $5.9 million in community development. That's mainly for transit related, so the facility that we're building and Beeline services. Public Works, Sewer and Refuse, $13.1 million. Glendale Water and Power, $20.6 million. And Information Services for Technology Projects, $451,000. For a total of $63.6 million in total capital improvement throughout the city. Slide 9 goes into our organizational profile. The next few slides are going to focus on the organizational profile. Our total city population went up from 199,000 to 201,668. Our total city employee count is 1,579. Some of the key information on this slide is just the residents served per FTE. For every FTE, we serve 128 residents citywide. If we were to look at it at the general fund level, for every employee in the general fund, we support 233 residents in the city. Same thing with budget. Total budget per capita is $4,064. Total budget for general fund per capita, $966. We do a personnel versus operating cost just to give us a measure of how we're doing. And our salaries and benefits for 16-17 were $241.7, operating costs $732 million. So if we do a personnel versus operating cost ratio at 33%. Our target is 35%, so we're well within our 35% target at 33%. When we do the same comparison for the general fund, we are at 77%. Our target is 75%, so we are not within our target. But as you can see, we are moving in the right direction because historically, if you look at 13-14, we were at 78.8% and have been inching down towards our goal and hope to be there soon. Finally, the citywide fee schedule. We have a total of 2,420 fees in the citywide fee schedule. 1,676 of them saw no changes. We deleted 77 fees, increased 75 fees, decreased 75 fees, increased 238, and then 302 of them for CPI increases, and added 52 new fees. So this is just an overall recap of our budget process, and I'm happy to answer any questions you have, and thank you for your time.
On the item on slide 12, where you mentioned CPI increases to existing fees, in a sense, that's the fact that the way this fee is set up, when cost of living changes, when the economic indicators change, it's automatically built in for an alteration.
Yes, correct.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions regarding this?
I mean, just my personal edification, going back to the capital improvement program recap. So I did a quick ratio. Out of the $63,659,000, I guess, if you divide it by the total of 819 for the 2016-17, so it means that roughly 7% of the budget is allocated to capital improvements.
That's correct.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Do we require a motion on this, or this was just informational?
No, it's just a report.
Just to recap the thousands of hours of work that took place in the budget process.
Okay, next item, please.
Next item is 6D, report from Vavrinic Tri-Day & Company, LLP, on the fiscal year ended June 30, 2016 audit. Soo-Jin Lee, Accounting Manager.
Good morning, Chair and committee members. My name is Soo-Jin Lee. I'm the accounting manager from the Finance Department. Today, we are here to present some information about the city's fiscal year 2016 audit. The city's current external auditor is Vavrinic Tri-Day & Company, in short, VTD. The city currently has a 3-year contract with VTD with the option to extend 2 more years. And this year, fiscal year 2016, is their 3rd year engagement. Actually, for the fiscal year 2016 audit, the VTD staff was in the city in the first 2 weeks of May for their preliminary fieldwork. At that time, the focus was the internal control. So they met with the staff from the various city departments, such as ISD, HR, payroll, and AP, and so on. And then in August, they will be back for another 2 more weeks to focus on single audit, fixed assets, and GASB 68. And then in October, when the first draft of the CAFR is completed, the VTD staff will be back in the city again for another 3 to 4 weeks for the final fieldwork to complete testing everything. So our goal is to have VTD issue their opinion letter by the end of November, and then we'll present the CAFR to the council in early December. And then today, Mr. David Showalter, the VTD audit partner, will be here to present you their detailed audit plan.
Good morning, Chairman. Excuse me for my voice and members of the committee. I'm losing my voice, so bear with me here. in your packet, you had a letter that was addressed to the committee members. So that's our standard letter that we do provide to the audit committee just as a communication letter. So you have a copy of the letter. There is a handout which basically summarizes what was in the letter to you. So just to make it a little easier. So just to recap, we are engaged to audit the fiscal year June 30, 2016 financial statements for the City of Glendale. I'm going to go through the slides, and if you have any questions, feel free to ask. The second slide just summarizes the audit team, and my name is David Showalter. I am the audit partner on the engagement. I have the final responsibility for the audit. I sign the audit opinion. There is another audit partner who's involved with the audit. His responsibility is to review all the reports prior to being issued. It's part of our firm's quality control process. And then Michael Shu, who's also in the audience, is the audit manager, and his responsibility is primarily to run the day-to-day audit, making sure everything is getting completed on time, and then assisting with the final phase of the audit and issuing the reports. The third slide covers the audit scope of our audit. So the city produces a comprehensive annual financial report on an annual basis. That includes the financial statements of the city as well as other supplementary information that goes with the financial statements. In addition, there's a single audit report, which is an audit of the federal programs that the city receives. The city is required to undergo an audit of those federal programs on an annual basis. We also conduct an audit of the City of Glendale Water and Power enterprise funds. So those enterprise funds, they are included in the city's comprehensive annual financial report, but they're also extracted and they're presented separately so that the city can prepare an annual report for the GWP operations for each fiscal year. So we provide an opinion on that. And then we also conduct the HUD REAC, which is because the city is a Section 8 recipient, there are some special reporting required by HUD. We do procedures related to that. We also do a GAN limit, agreed upon procedures. We prepare a tax return for the Development Corp. And then we also audit the ISIS JPA as well, which is a separate legal entity. Slide 4 just primarily summarizes what our responsibility is under our generally accepted auditing standards. So as Shujin mentioned, we were out in May conducting our preliminary risk assessment as well as updating our understanding of internal controls as it relates to financial transactions and balances that flow into the financial statements. So we do meet with various departments. We do go through and update that understanding as well as selecting transactions that do flow through those transaction cycles to ensure that the controls, as we understand those controls are, as well as the policies and procedures of the City of Glendale, those transactions are flowing through the process that will ensure that those transactions are initiated properly and are recorded properly, and that any errors can be detected through that process if there were any. And then as a result of that, we'll design our audit procedures for the final phase of the audit when we do come back out in October, and that phase of the audit is primarily looking at the year-end balances. So we're looking at the year-end balances for cash and investments, debt, looking at the revenue and expense for the year-end, doing analytical procedures over those areas, as well as designing other procedures and confirming and other types of procedures to make sure that those account balances are fairly stated. We also perform tests of compliance with certain laws and regulations. Because the city is a governmental entity, we have responsibilities under the government auditing standards to consider compliance. So areas such as budget compliance, investment policy, procurement policies, as those relate to the financial statements. And then we also look at the federal compliance as well. And then our responsibility is to opine on the financial statements and then and also express an opinion on the major programs. And then when we do come back out at final, when I refer to final, when we come back out in October, the city will provide us with a draft of their financial statements. And our process with that is to review the draft, ensure that all the balances that are in the draft tie out to underlying support, and then we perform audit procedures over various account balances based on risk, materiality, and so forth to make sure that those balances are fairly stated in all material respects. In addition, there's a management's discussion analysis. This is the front section of the financial statements, and what this is required by GAAP is that management provide an analysis of the financial statements comparing last year to this year, and explaining, essentially what changed and why those changes occurred. Our responsibility with that information is to read it, make sure that it complies with generally accepted accounting principles, but we don't opine on that section of the financial statements. And in addition, there is supplementary information that's attached to the financial statements. This is essentially each of the funds that the city maintains, more at a more detailed level. Again, we review that information, make sure that it ties back to the underlying support, and our opinion on that would be in relation to the financial statements taken as a whole. And then there are statistical information and a letter of transmittal that's also attached to the comprehensive annual financial report, which we don't take responsibility for. Slide 5. Again, our responsibility under generally accepted auditing standards. At the conclusion of the audit, we will communicate our significant findings that we have with you related to the audit. This is another letter that will be presented to the audit committee, and those bullet points will be addressed within that letter. Slide 6 addresses the plan, timing, and scope of the audit. And as you can see, our planning and our interim phase started in May, will be wrapped up in August, and then we're back out in October. And we have an agreed upon issuance date of November 23rd, 2016, which is the day before Thanksgiving, so we're hopeful for that. And then our HUD REACT AUP, or agreed upon procedures, is due March 31, 2017. Slide 7, more from a high-level perspective, just provides a thumbnail of what we do at the various stages of the audit. The risk assessment phase and the interim phase is where we meet with management. We start to scope out what has happened during the year, what are some of the changes, what are there new risks that have occurred that we need to be aware of with respect to our audit. We start looking at interim financial information just to determine if there's any significant changes from the prior year. We also consider fraud, and this is a matter of where we go out and we ask individuals within the city if they're aware of any fraud risk or if they're aware of any fraud, and we also consider tone at the top. This is where management sets policies and procedures that would reflect an organization that cares about doing the right thing. So we ask those questions to make sure that employees at the lower level or at the middle level or at the upper level all reflect the same attitude with respect to internal controls and doing the right thing with respect to financial reporting. Our interim phase of the audit addresses the internal control design and implementation. We're also looking into key business cycles that we've listed a few there that we drill down into at a more detailed level to get that understanding of key controls. You've heard a lot about controls already this morning. So things that we are looking for are segregation of duties, compensating controls, all of those areas that if those areas aren't working properly, then there is a higher degree of risk that there could be a material misstatement in the financial statements. We start planning our single audit interim, and then we're also we were doing some pension plan census data testing as well over the GASB 68. And then the final phase of the audit, which is the next slide, again, we review the financial statements. We perform tests of detail over material account balances and significant classes of transactions. A significant class of transaction would be something where there are numerous transactions that flow through an account, such as a revenue account or an expenditure account. We also send out third-party confirmations as it relates to cash and investments, debt, and loans. We also determine the adequacy of financial statement disclosures. We go through whether there's any new accounting pronouncements that need to be implemented, and we work through that. Last year, we worked through the GASB 68 implementation, which was a significant new pronouncement. This year, there are some additional new pronouncements that I'll cover briefly on the next few slides. Year 2 of GASB 68 is also we'll be looking into this year. Last year, the city was required to implement GASB 68 and bring on the net pension liability onto the financial statements. This is year 2, so it's basically making sure that what was implemented last year from a policy and procedure perspective and making sure things were getting reported in financial statements correctly, that is occurring again this year. And then we go through the review phase of the financial statements and go through the QC review of the financial statements. And then at the conclusion of the audit, we meet with management. We'll go through whether there's any audit adjustments that need to be reflected in the financial statements. We'll go through whether there's any findings that need to be reflected in our reports. And then management provides us with a corrective action. And then we have our required communications back with the audit committee. Okay. And then the next few slides, slide 10 addresses new accounting pronouncements that are effective for 2016. And there are 3 new pronouncements that are effective. GASB 72 is going to be effective this year related to the fair value of investments in the financial statements for the city. There was already a previous standard that addressed fair value. What this standard does is redefine what fair value is. And so the city will have to ensure that their investments are disclosed in the financial statements in accordance with the new definition, which essentially is fair value is measured as kind of an exit price as opposed to an entry price method. There will be some additional disclosures as it relates to the investments this year. With respect to how the city was able to determine the fair value, and then there will be some categories that will be disclosed, or levels, level 1, 2, or 3, and those levels will correspond with how the fair value was obtained. GASB 73 deals with some additional pension reporting, which we've evaluated this, and we don't think that this is going to have an effect on the city's financial statements. And then GASB 76 deals with the hierarchy of generally accepted accounting principles. This is basically the GASB redefining what is generally accepted accounting principles and more or less letting the users and the preparers of the financial statements know that GASB standards, GASB implementation guide, and other types of resources that the GASB produces fall into what we refer to as GAAP. And so anything that's outside of that literature, those standards, would not be GAAP. So it's just more or less just redefining what GAAP is. One thing I want to point out is that the GASB has been extremely busy over the last few years, and you'll see effective 2017 that we have 6 new standards that are effective. On page 12, actually 81 and 82 are going to be effective in 2018. So there are a significant amount of new accounting pronouncements that have to be implemented just going into this year and next year. So over the course of 2 years, about approximately 10 new standards have to be implemented. So puts a toll on management. It puts a toll on the resources of the finance department. Obviously, VTD is there to help out with the city. They always do a great job. The city does a great job of reaching out to VTD, asking questions. We want to reach out early on as possible to help with the implementation process, but the GASB is just not making it any easier. And so some of the new standards that are coming up are related to pension. Obviously, we have an OPEB standard that's coming out here in the next few years, which is very similar to what the GASB 68 was for pensions. This is going to be for your other post-employment benefits. And so I know the city has been making changes to the OPEB plan, and how all that settles will kind of reflect how this standard will impact the city's plan. But that's just kind of a flavor as to what the GASB is doing. They're really starting to push out some pretty significant accounting standards on municipalities that does create a lot of extra work and a lot of extra effort. So last year with GASB 68, the city did a fantastic job with GASB 68 implementation. So I'm quite certain that they will be able to champion all these new standards coming up here in the next few years. So. Yeah, just I think the next significant accounting standard will deal with the OPEB standard, and basically what that is addressing is bringing on whatever OPEB liability that the city has that's currently disclosed in a financial statement would be reflected actually in its net position or on its balance sheet, similar to the pension plan. So with that, if this ends my presentation, if you have any questions, feel free.
Thank you, Mr. Showalter. Any questions? Yes.
Looking on screen 3, where you listed the scope of services,
yes,
and then your presentation through the rest of the screens, it says next to the last line, consider compliance with Senate Bill 341. I don't recall hearing any comment beyond that one line, and my question is, why do we get to consider it?
Okay. That's a good question. So Senate Bill 341 dealt with as a result of the RDA dissolution, when the RDA is dissolved, of course there was a housing component related to the RDAs as well. So SB 371 has somewhat resurrected some of the compliance requirements as it relates to the housing component that the former RDAs were required to do. There was some reporting and other types of reports that had to be submitted, and also reports that have to be placed on the city's website that talk about kind of the low-income housing stock that you have in the city and what you're doing in your activities for the year. So there isn't, previous to SB 341, under the old rules, the external auditor was required to audit the housing, kind of the housing compliance, and then issue a report on that. That's not required anymore. But under SB 341, the requirement is that the fund, the Lomont Housing Fund, is required to have an audit, which the city is complying with because that's part of the annual audit. But there isn't really any specific reporting out that's required. So as part of our audit, we look into to make sure that there is nothing that's changed, that as far as compliance, as far as how we interpret the compliance and how the city interprets the compliance, we don't come across any instances of noncompliance, but we're not issuing a standalone or a separate report as it relates to that because it's not a requirement under the
So
under
this
the
makes
Senate
it
bill.
simpler by including it within the general audit of the city.
Yeah, basically. So the city has asked us to consider it as part of our audit, but we're not actually providing a standalone opinion on compliance with that. So.
I know that GASB 68 had a tremendous impact on, net position and reporting. How significant is the OPEB requirement going to be? I mean, not as significant as, is it going to be as significant as?
It could have been. I can answer that. The city undertook the GASB liability that has been valued last several years since, was it 2007 that we first started having to value what that disclosure is. It had been steadily increasing. The last valuation was approximately $240 million. The majority of that liability was created by what's called an implied subsidy from the history of blending our medical rates with our retirees. So in preparation for this upcoming, we undertook negotiating with all our bargaining groups to unblend our medical rates, which then ended the implied subsidy. The latest report, and Sujin can correct me, the liability reduced from approximately $240 million down to about 22. So the impact will be significantly less when we go to book that in several years.
Thank you. Any other questions for Mr. Showalter?
I guess I have a question. Based on your experience, seeing that this is happening across the country, right? How is this affecting generally the credit worthiness of cities like Glendale, for example? And now you talked about the Gatsby 72. I'm thinking cities that have major investments and you're going to price it based on the exit price is going to be a significantly small number, may not have a major or immediate effect on the budget, but like on the financial statements, it may have a significant effect in terms of like how creditworthy a city is. So is that, in your opinion, going to affect us, or?
I don't know at this point if that's going to be something that will affect the city. I think that looking at the types of investments that the city has, they're pretty conservative. So from a fair value difference between what was being reported in the prior year and what will be reported this year, I don't expect that there's going to be much of a variance between the two. Most of the city's investments are pretty short term. So that you're already pretty close to what, the fair value and cost of that asset are pretty close. And this standard only applies to investments that are purchased for gain or profit. So the city can look around and the city makes, you use the term investment, but if that investment is for public benefit, then the fair value rules don't apply to it. So if you purchase a housing complex and you're going to charge low income rent, but obviously that complex is generating income, but it's for a public benefit. It's not for necessarily, the city is not getting into the business of real estate investment. So while it is, inherently, there is some investment there, but the GASB standard is kind of deviates between, okay, if this is just for gain or profit, then it needs to be fair valued in accordance with the rules of the standard. But if it's for public benefit purposes, then it's not required to be fair valued. So really we're only isolating everything down primarily to the pool, the treasurer's pool, mostly. And the investments in the pool are primarily heavily in investments that are with a short-term duration. They're not long-term investments. There's no equity investments because they're not allowed. So you're really just government securities, money market funds, commercial paper, and the fair value difference between what we would expect under the previous standard and this standard, I don't think that there's going to be a significant change. Yeah. So
thank you.
Keep in mind this new pronouncement is kind of an update to GASB 31, which was really in reaction to the Orange County debacle of years ago when the Orange County treasurer was purchasing reverse repos, and then the market value was significantly different from the book value. And at balance sheet date, there was no reconciliation between market value and book value. And that became the term mark to market, where you actually have to look at those investments and look at the market price, which then you would revalue and book a loss if the market value was significantly different than the book value. So that's what GASB 31 aimed to do, and this is kind of a refresher on GASB 31.
Any other questions for Mr. Showalter? Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Rest that voice.
Yeah, thank you.
Next item.
Number 7, audit committee or staff comments.
No comments. Number 8.
Is new business.
I have no new business. And adjournment. Motion, please.
So moved.
Second.
Thank you. We are adjourned.